same sort of thing. Well, this is real Christian scholarship and that's not, sort of thing. But again, I would also want to avoid at the other end that it just whatever you're doing is fine. I think there might be some common concerns, perhaps, that Christians would share or Latter-day Saints would share. But again, setting that out, and then, I mean, we're really good at committees, but getting a committee together to decide, okay, this, as long as you espouse this, then you have a testimony. I find that horrible.
So I think I've got a couple of responses. One is I think that I think the Temple Recommend interview is a wonderful sort of metric to analogy that George brings up. And if you think about when you go into your Temple Recommend interview, none of the questions involve, do you do this better than somebody else? Am I more honest than Alan Wilkins? It's an easy one. Okay, that's a no-brainer. But so I think that, you know, again, there are some personal standards, but I think that where there's a germ of truth in your response is that the relevant metric is not, am I better than Don Adolphson, but am I better than I was yesterday? And over time, I mean, I think there's a, you know, when you graduate from your doctoral program, there's sort of this sense of, you know, religion is going to be the poison that would taint true science and stay away from it. And I think the longer you get in the game, the more you realize that's sort of, it's not possible. And so I think the relevant question is, am I a better Christian scholar today than I was yesterday? Just like, am I a better Christian today than I was yesterday? But I think it's too easy to look outside and say, well, I'm better than him, clearly. Therefore, lots of things sort of follow. Now, you know, lest it be sort of total do whatever you want. I think internally there are certainly things I would never want to study why corrupt organizations outperform non-corrupt organizations. I mean, for me, that's just sort of, you know, or why does bribery work? For some reason, you know, that kind of question just doesn't even get on my radar screen, but it might get on somebody else's radar screen, and I think that's part of where being a Christian scholar will help define some of the questions we see as legitimate to ask and others that we see as illegitimate.
We got somebody. Would you like to have a question? Let's take another 3 minutes or so, finish around noon, but please.
Well, George kind of brought this up in the beginning when he says it's better to be right, or it's better to be good, than right. And, you know, we're using those two words together, Christian scholar, and I don't know that we'll ever be faced with the choice of having to be one or the other. But I think in maybe proposing that, there's maybe evidence of what it means to be a Christian scholar. If we were faced with having to either respond as a Christian or respond as a scholar, which would carry more weight? And perhaps we might not ever be faced with having to do that, but perhaps we might. And in the tendencies and maybe our exchanges, maybe this is kind of response to that, you know, being on one side of the fence or the other. If we agree to disagree, but are we Christian in our behavior? That maybe then to me is the root of what being a Christian is and still being a scholar. Not abandoning the one for the other in some respects, but if we had to, would you stand by scholarship and abandon the covenants that, you know, Paul Navy's talked about in his base as being the foundation for his Christian scholarship in the name of being a scholar? Or would we do the opposite? I don't know. It poses an interesting question.
You know, I just a quick anecdote. I had a job interview it was actually at Brandeis University about 15 years ago, and I desperately wanted this job at the time, and was giving my job talk, and someone asked a question about a scholar whom I did not recognize. I mean, I didn't even know the name. You know, they said, "What do you think about the book by so and so?" And I was probably a little bit naive. I'm not trying to make myself out to be Christian in the way I responded, but it was an honest response. I said, I don't know. I said, I've never read the book. I don't know the scholarship, so I can't answer the question. I thought that was a pretty simple thing, but afterwards, the chair of the hiring committee, this didn't get me the job, but the chair of the hiring committee said to me, I've never seen a scholar say he didn't know something and just leave it at that. I was so impressed, you know. So I think, to me, that was, again, it didn't get me the job, but it sort of, it was a lesson to me about the importance of honesty, intellectual honesty, right? And I think that there's sort of an unspoken code about scholarly excellence that is not all that honest, right? In terms of giving a spin to something when you're really not knowing what you're talking about, or not acknowledging the fair ground or common ground that you share with somebody who seems to be coming from a different point of view. So I think that has to be something we actually do practice, and I have found over the years that just trying to practice that, both in terms of interpersonal communication at a conference, but even in the way I write, the way that I disagree with another scholar in my footnotes. You know, it's sort of going back to this idea that at BYU, you know, your chair could be your bishop. The guy who's making you really angry in front of you on the road could be your home teacher, so on and so forth. I mean, you know, academics is not that small of a world where you could write something about somebody's point of view and you end up meeting them. And if you can't say what you said in print to them in the face, you probably should have written it differently. That's sort of, and I feel like that's a basic Christian ethic. I mean, I know that's, you know, also a secular ethic in lots of other circles. It's not unique to Christianity, but I think that's an important practice, and I think that actually shapes the way you think.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because to me you're saying you're a disciple first. You adhere to those principles first and foremost, and that shapes your scholarship. And it's not that you would be any less of a scholar because that would maybe make you less of a disciple, but you're a disciple first.
I had as you were asking that question, making those comments, I was reflecting a bit. In my own experience, I've had those moments where I really worried, what's going to happen if I say this? I feel like I have to. I've gone back to the Lord several times. Do I have to? And thus far, to say it like my dad would say, he's kind of saved my bacon. I haven't had to be in a situation, something has worked out and things have resolved themselves. But I had an experience in graduate school of listening to a man who was in a situation where he had to he chose to make a stand. It was, I did my graduate work at a Catholic school back in Pennsylvania, and there was a presentation on campus. A Catholic bishop had come from Rwanda, and he had been involved there in the civil war between the Hutus and the Tutsis and the mess there. And at one point, the villagers had found out that the Tutsis, I believe it was, they were going to come and gather everybody up and take them to a relocation camp, so to speak. Which really meant they were just going to pile them in trucks and then execute them. And so they all came to this bishop's church seeking sanctuary and protection, and he herded everyone into the church until it was filled, totally filled. And then he had them close the doors and lock them behind him. And as he finished this up, then the soldiers come with their trucks and their guns, and the officer leading the soldiers comes up and says, "We know you're hiding them here. They have to get on. I have the order from the government. This is to be done. Step out of the way." And the bishop said, "You're not going into my church with hate in your heart." And they argued back and forth about that, and he would not step out of the way. And eventually the officer pulled out a pistol and held it to his head, cocked and ready, and said, "I could just shoot you, and we will burn the church. You're not getting into my church with hate in your heart." And after a tense moment, then the officer shouldered his weapon and gathered his men and left. Well, it was a powerful story to have him telling us, but at the end in the question and answer session, someone stood up in the back and had their question, and he said, "Bishop, that was a profound story. It was powerful." He said, but weren't you afraid that he was going to kill you? And the bishop's response to that question has been kind of a profound lesson to me that I've gone back to many times. He said, as a Christian, there are some things that are worse than death. And I've always took that to be, as a Latter-day Saint, there are some things that are worse than professional suicide. Fortunately, the Lord has opened a pathway to me and hasn't put me in that situation yet. But if He does, I hope that I have that kind of faith and commitment.
Wonderful session. Thank you. We could continue this, couldn't we? There's some more to say, and I hope it doesn't take us 3,000 years to answer your question, William.
Yeah, that's
the challenge of your father, Rick.
That was a really good question.
We'll keep thinking about it. I see echoes in what you've said about faithfulness, about being a disciple, about learning by revelation, through being disciples first, and having that necessarily influence how you do your scholarship. Something about that relates to what it means to be an LDS scholar. And while I hear Paul's response to Gantt about did you get that revelation on the steps, on the stairs, because you were LDS? I think you're right. I think that faithful people anywhere can ask Heavenly Father, and if there's faith, and if they're seeking, they will find. Is there something about this university or about us as LDS scholars that makes that more likely because we're obedient? Because that was President Kimball's vision. His vision was that from this place would leave stars who would be as gifted as Mozart, as Shakespeare, as name your scientist, but who would also have the Holy Ghost, who would be people of integrity, who would be Christians, indeed Latter-day Saints, and that would make a difference somehow. And that's what I hope in 3,000 years we find what that difference means. We have a higher proportion of PhD students than almost any. We're number 7th in the country. We have a lot. And it used to be said about Utah, we have the highest proportion of people with doctorates of any state in the Union. There's something about learning and about becoming that I hope is a part of that learning, not just the learning part, is a part of who we are. And I really want to tease that question for a while. I hope we keep thinking about it, that it's diverse. It's diverse. There's not a one-size-fits-all here, but there are some elements that are common. So thank you for stimulating our thinking. Thank you for who you are.